The time period of the Sultanate of Women, which lasted 100 years, where the women of the harem were running the empire, saw a period of territorial stability but internal chaos within the key institution of the Ottoman Empire, the House of Osman. And Turhan Hatice had become the last Walida Sultan. She was the official regent of her son Mehmed IV, who was just a child caliph. But very soon it was clear that she was not as capable as her predecessors in her role at running the empire. So she very quickly signed over her powers as the regent to the newly appointed Grand Vizier. He was an Albanian man called Ahmed III, and he and his successors, who were all from his family, would lead the Ottoman Empire and oversee the long rule of Mehmed IV, which was about 40 years, and brought a lot of progress and even made the Ottomans a threat to Central Europe again. First, the empire was run by 10 great rulers on the bounds. Then it was run by the women of the harem. And now it was the time of the Grand Viziers to take the empire forward. When Mehmed Kaprulu became the Grand Vizier, the Ottomans were not in a very good shape. They just lost a war against the Safavids. They were fighting the Venetians over a Mediterranean island. There was economic problems. The Janissaries were interfering in politics. There was intrigue in the harem, and the stature of the Sultan Caliph had been completely diminished. He managed to win the war over the Mediterranean island due to his tactics, but the main thing he did was that he was able to put people in positions in the Ottoman political apparatus who had an ethos of excellence and excelling, which really helped them to propel the machine forward. Other people in his family would follow him in his role as Grand Vizier, none less than his son-in-law, who was called Kara Mustafa, and he had something in his mind second only to the conquest of Constantinople itself. He had his eyes on Vienna, the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Old Habsburg Fall. In the 1600s, the Ottoman Empire had reached its territorial maximum, and the Grand Viziers had negotiated a 20-year truce with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which allowed them to fix internal problems. However, when Kara Mustafa became the Grand Vizier, he decided in 1683 that he wanted to take Vienna. He thought that the Austro-Hungarians were weak and the other states in Europe would not support them. So he marched with 100,000 soldiers north and reached the walls of the great city. When the emperor of the Austro-Hungarians saw the sight of 100,000 Ottomans, he was called Leopold, he fled the city. So you can see he was not like Constantine XI at all. The siege went on and the Ottomans were having some success. But then, unexpectedly, the other states in Europe, smaller states in Europe, had allied together to come and form a relief force led by the King of Poland. And what ensued was the largest cavalry charge the world had ever seen to that date, and it completely decimated the Ottoman besiegers, and they had to flee. When they got back to Constantinople, Mehmed IV blamed it all on Kara Mustafa, who was then executed. Never again would the Ottomans threaten Vienna, never again would the Ottomans threaten Central Europe. Many Western historians, when they look at the Second Siege of Vienna, they label it as just another confrontation between Islam and Christianity. But in doing so, they miss key details which suggest otherwise. For example, the French Empire were very well aware that the Ottomans were going to undertake this siege, and they were actually on the side of the Ottomans. They wanted the Ottomans to take the city from their fellow co-religionists, the Austro-Hungarians, who were also Catholic like the French. So reducing these events to just what religion the participants were is overly simplistic. There's another French connection in the siege of Vienna. You see, the bakers during the siege woke up early in the morning to bake their bread, and they were the ones who heard some noises coming from below their feet, and that's when they realized the Ottomans were tunneling under the walls, trying to blow the walls up. So they alerted the authorities, and the authorities came and they managed to get rid of this threat. But the bakers never forgot their role in the siege of Vienna, so they cooked, or they came up with, or they made a new type of bread to commemorate their role in the victory in the siege, and they called this bread kipfel, and in their language it translates as crescent. Why did they call it crescent? Because the Ottoman soldiers had crescents on their flags, so it would remind them of the time when they ate up the Ottomans. A few generations down the line, a Austrian princess was given to a French prince in marriage, and she moved over to France. And when she got there, she asked for kipfel, this crescent bread, and they didn't know what she was going on about, so she had to show them what it was. And when they did, they made it for her, and then they started to call it the French word for crescent, which is of course a croissant. So the next time you have a croissant, make sure you remember the second siege of Vienna, the time when the Ottoman Muslims nearly took Central Europe. It's alright, nothing special. States like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Venetians and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth realized that if they teamed up together they could defeat the Ottomans. They also realized that now militarily they were on a par with the Ottomans, and the air of the invincible Turk had, in the mind of the European, had completely gone. The result was something called the Grand Turk War, which lasted between 1684 and 1697, a series of battles in Eastern Europe where the conquest of Suleiman the Magnificent got rolled back and Hungary was lost to these more Central European states. And the Ottomans did get to keep their Romanian territories, but the situation was very different to the 1300s and the 1400s, when the Ottomans would be able to defeat a much larger coalition of states from Central Europe. In the year 1700, things were not looking good for the Ottomans at all. But in 1703, a man called Ahmed III ascended the throne and became the Caliph, and he did three good things. Number one, he managed to win some minor border skirmishes with other empires. Number two, he signed good treaties with them. And number three, he made good internal reforms. And this led to 50 years of stability by the year 1750. And that was something that was unimaginable straight after the Great Turk War and the signing of the Treaty of Karlovac. The problem is, though, this is geopolitics, and in this game nothing is stagnant. Things are always just about to change. In the mid to late 1700s, empires were coming and going. The Safavid Empire in the east collapsed, and another empire was on the rise in the north. And this new empire in the north would prove to be a thorn in the Ottoman side for the next 150 years. And it would prove to be a territorial threat and also an ideological threat to the Ottomans' multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire. That empire was the Russian Empire, led by Tsar Peter the Great. He had used mass conscription to turn his peasant population into a huge standing army, trained by the best military officers in Europe to high standards, and that allowed him to compete with Europe on the chessboard of European geopolitics. And the Russian Empire was not a traditional foe of the Ottomans, and therefore their emergence came under the radar, and their military capabilities were completely unknown to the empire. The Russian Empire was a threat to the Ottoman Empire for a number of reasons. They were an Orthodox Christian empire, and the ruler had adopted the title Tsar. And Tsar in the Russian language means Caesar, so they saw themselves as the successor state to the Byzantine Roman Empire, which the Ottomans had conquered. Also, they had styled Moscow as the third Rome, Rome in Italy being the first Rome, Constantinople under the Ottomans being the second Rome, and Moscow being the third Rome. So for the third Rome, the Russians, to take over the second Rome, for the Ottoman Empire, would have been something would be very prestigious for them. Another reason would be that a lot of the population, or the non-Muslim population in the Balkans, were Orthodox Christians, so there was a fear that the Tsar would be able to pull them into his sphere of influence. Another reason why they were a threat is that the Russians are a Slavic ethnicity, and the population in Eastern Europe for the Ottomans, many of them were Slavic. So for them to accept a Slavic Orthodox ruler from Moscow was a lot easier for them to accept a Catholic Germanic ruler of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And lastly, if the Russians ever got access to the Black Sea, then they would very easily be able to sail their ships down the Straits of the Bosphorus and attack Constantinople, the second Rome, and the heartbeats of the Ottoman Empire. In 1768, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was at war with the Russian Empire, and for some reason the Ottoman Empire decided to get involved on the side of the Polish. And this turned out to be a great mistake, because it resulted in the Russian Empire turning its forces around and pointing them directly at the Ottomans. And they were able to enter deep into Ottoman territory, into Eastern Europe, with 300,000 highly trained soldiers, and the Ottomans did not know what hit them. So now the Ottomans were faced with a choice: either keep on fighting and lose huge chunks of the empire, or sign an embarrassing treaty. They chose the option to sign an embarrassing treaty, and that was known as the Treaty of Kuchuk-Kayanaka, which would have immense ramifications for the Ottoman Empire for the next 200 years. The first point in the treaty was the issue of the Crimea, which had always been an Ottoman vassal and a Muslim land. The Crimea was to change hands and now become a Russian vassal state, and this was very, very embarrassing for the Caliph in Constantinople, because what it meant was he couldn't protect his Muslim subjects anymore. The second thing about the treaty was that it allowed the Russians to have a port on the Black Sea. 300 years earlier, the plan of Muhammad al-Fatih was to make a ring around the Black Sea with either land that he controlled or land that he'd vassalized, such as the Crimea. That would stop any other empires getting access to it via ship and stop them sailing down the Black Sea and reaching his capital and being a threat to Constantinople. Well, this ring had now gone, and now Constantinople, for the rest of its existence, would always be under threat. And the third thing about this treaty was the issue of minorities within the empire. The Christian minorities, and including in that the Orthodox Christians, had always been under the millet system, and by and large had been very happy with it. But now, according to the terms of this treaty, the Orthodox Christians in the empire were now to see the Tsar as their spiritual lead and come out of the millet system. That meant that 25% of the Ottoman population would now take orders from another empire while still remaining Ottoman citizens, which is highly, highly embarrassing. All this showed the Russians and other powers that the Ottomans were no longer a great power, and they could be bossed about pretty easily. You might be asking yourself, how did the Ottomans fall so far behind the other European empires so quickly? Well, the reasons are numerous. Constantinople and the Ottoman Empire used to be the center of all trade routes from the north, the south, the east and the west. But at the end of the 1400s, the Portuguese, followed very soon after by other European empires, sailed round the tip of Africa and therefore entered the Indian Ocean and started trading directly with the East. Therefore, the middleman, the Ottoman Empire, was cut out, and this affected them greatly. So their economy wasn't doing as well, and therefore they didn't have the means to make the technological and the military advancements that they needed in order to keep on winning with the battlefield and keep up with other empires. Secondly, the Ottoman Empire was an empire with a small e. What I mean by that is they were not a colonial empire. When they took over lands, they didn't milk that land for all its natural and human resources. They would tax that province and spend that tax locally. It wasn't as if all the money from the provinces was coming to Constantinople and impoverishing all the other regions. Other empires were colonial empires, which means they could milk their subject populations and the lands that they conquered for everything that they could get, and therefore they had virtually unlimited means to make their technological and military advancements, and it showed on the battlefield. It also has to be said that there was an air of complacency that sets in, as does with all empires when they've been around so long. The ones who attain power when the empire is at its peak don't have the same drive, the same determination and the same will to move things forward like the people at the beginning of the empire, who have to fight and use their blood, their sweat and their tears to make it. And lastly, the Ottoman Empire was so big, it allowed it to project its power far and wide, but it also meant that it came into contact with very distinct, different problems from varying geographical regions, which they had to deal with all at the same time. What that means is, if someone within spitting distance of the Ottomans sneezed, the Ottomans would catch a cold. In this episode, we have seen how the Ottomans arrived at the gates of Vienna in 1683, and they were threatening the gates of Europe. But by the end of the 1700s, the Russian Empire had arisen and were threatening Constantinople itself. The balance of power had completely changed, and the situation was not looking good for the Ottomans at all. But then, all of a sudden, the balance of power was to change again, because there was a new nation led by a new man who completely made Russia forget about attacking and conquering the Ottoman Empire and focus on defending themselves. That man had a very famous saying. He said, "If the world was a country, then Constantinople would be its capital." If you want to know who that was and whether he would be a friend or a foe to the Ottomans, make sure you subscribe, hit the bell button and watch my next episode in the series From Ertugrul to Ataturk. Salam.